Hey guys, Colleen here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about spring reverb. So when you hear the word reverb, you can kind of imagine in your mind what that sounds like. Reverb is basically sound waves bouncing off of surfaces. The spring reverb was invented by Lawrence Hammond in the 1930s, and he wanted to incorporate spring reverb tanks in his Hammond organs. This is because traditionally Hammond organs were used in churches. And in a church, a preacher is projecting their voice, and they don't really want their voice to be echoing everywhere. So they had to dampen those rooms, but then the organ would kind of sound dry. So the reverb in the organs would help add depth to the organ sound. Hammond licensed their reverb tanks to Fender, and Fender started using them in their amps in the early 60s. And then spring reverb tanks and guitar amps, especially Fender, became legendary in the 60s for the sound of surf rock guitar. So let's get a little bit of a closer look at a reverb tank. I'll talk a little bit about how they work, and we can talk about what happens when a tank goes bad. Okay, so here is the back of a Fender Princeton Reverb reissue amp. And I'm going to show you where you will typically find reverb tanks. This is true for most amps. They're typically in the bottom of the cabinet. Sometimes, like in Silvertone 1484s, you'll find a tiny little spring reverb tank mounted to the chassis. That's not as common. So let's take off the back panel and I'll show you where to find it. All right, so here in this bag lies the reverb tank. In some of the reissues, they're like Velcroed in, but in a lot of the vintage amps, they'll be actually screwed into the bottom of the cabinet. All right, so you'll see that this tank is mounted to a piece of cardboard, and this is kind of to protect the springs and the internals of the reverb tank. So I'll unscrew the tank from the cardboard. If you're ever like transporting your amp and it's in the car and you hear the sound, those are the springs jangling around. All right, let's take a closer look. So we have our input and output connections. These connect the reverb tank to and from the amp. Here's the input side. So basically the dry guitar signal enters into here and then goes into what we call the input transducer. And this is basically like a mini transformer. And the input transducer is transforming the electrical energy from the amp and the dry guitar signal into mechanical movement to actually move the springs. And then the opposite happens in the output transducer over here. It's turning mechanical energy back into electrical energy so that the signal can go forth through the rest of the amp. This is a really common tank. This is like the most common. These are used in most Fender amps. It's the 4AB 3C 1B tank. And all of these numbers and letters mean different things. They basically represent the length of the tank, the input and output impedances of the tank. So if you have an amp with reverb and the reverb is not working, these are the two main things that go bad. More often than not, it's the tank itself. Sometimes like one of the wires will break. Sometimes like a transducer will go bad. In that case, I typically just replace the tank. Commonly, the RCA cables will be bad, especially if they're kind of like flimsy like these. It's common that the connections will break or they'll come loose. Not as common, but it definitely does happen. Sometimes the reverb drive or reverb recovery tubes go bad. Basically, the reverb drive tube is getting the signal ready to go to the reverb tank, and the reverb recovery tube is basically amplifying the signal after it has gone through the reverb tank. And then here we have the reverb transformer, and sometimes these do go bad as well. So a little less common, but it definitely does happen that those things fail. Another common reverb related issue I see is the reverb tank itself is feeding back. And that's not very pleasant when you're playing reverb and then it just starts feeding back on itself. So sometimes the tank itself is just prone to feedback, and in those instances, you just have to try a different tank. But first, I like to try kind of like messing with the position of the tank. If the tank is positioned like this, with the RCA jacks facing towards you, that sometimes makes the reverb tank more prone to feedback. So I like to turn it around so the reverb jacks are facing towards the speaker. All right, let's hear how the reverb sounds. Another fun fact about reverb is that in the 60s, reverb was an option to install with your car stereo. And I guess that was intended to create the effect of being in like a concert hall or something like that. I have been in old cars where there is reverb, and it's a pretty unique and funky effect in a car. But I hope you guys enjoyed this little informative video on reverb tanks. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. If you're watching this video before June 1st, 2024, there's still one slot left for our New York class, our 5E3 Deluxe Build 3-day workshop out of Main Drag Music in Brooklyn, New York. So if you are interested in signing up for that last minute, please shoot me an email. We're really looking forward to the class. I think it's going to be such a blast. Thanks y'all for tuning in, and I'll end with a quick word from our sponsor.
You know, Hank, I've got all these demos that I recorded years ago that I would love to upload, to share and stream. So I decided, why not try out DistroKid? As we know, DistroKid is a service that helps musicians upload their music to all major streaming platforms. The app is so user-friendly. You can upload album art straight from your phone, and it's really easy to input all of the track information, and then you just upload the track, and boom, you're done. Viewers of my channel get 30% off at the link I will post below. It's distrokid.com/VIP/Fazio. So go check it out, get those dusty old demos or your fresh, sparkly new tracks. Whatever it may be, get it uploaded.